They watched her pack her parachute with the precision of a surgeon, every fold deliberate, every check methodical. When Staff Sergeant Morrison announced the training jump would be from 3,000 feet, she shook her head and walked away. Called her a coward, said she'd lost her nerve. Whispered that maybe civilian instructors weren't cut out for real military training. She never defended herself, never explained why she only jumped from above 10,000 feet. But when General Rodriguez walked into that hangar and saw what they were mocking, she did something that made the entire room go silent. She pulled out a classified file that had been buried for a decade and revealed the mission that no one was supposed to survive. The jump that changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Nevada desert was already a furnace by 7 in the morning, turning the tarmac into a shimmering lake of heat that could melt the solace of cheap boots. Nellis Air Force Base stretched across the landscape like a military city, all concrete. Runways and steel hangars rising from the sand like monuments to precision and power. Inside Hangar 7, the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the desert sun, and the smell of aviation fuel mixed with hot metal created an atmosphere that separated the serious from the weekend warriors. Maria Santos had been working here for 18 months, long enough that the questions about where she came from had mostly stopped, but not long enough for people to stop wondering who she really was. She'd arrived on a Tuesday in January, carrying certifications that checked out perfectly, references that were solid but vague, and a skill set that made the base commander sign her contract without hesitation. Jump instructor, parachute rigger, safety coordinator for high-altitude training operations. On paper, she was exactly what they needed. In person, she was something else entirely. 47 years old with black hair streaked silver that she kept braided military tight, olive skin weathered by sun and wind, and dark eyes that seemed to calculate distances and wind speeds even when she was standing still. Her civilian contractor uniform was always pressed, her boots always polished, and her equipment maintained with the kind of obsessive care that spoke of training where failure meant death, not just embarrassment. But there was something about Maria that felt different from the usual contractors who cycled through Nellis. Maybe it was how she never complained about the heat or the impossible schedules, or the way some of the younger airmen treated civilian staff. Maybe it was the way she worked alone, but somehow always finished her equipment checks ahead of schedule. Or maybe it was how she'd look at weather patterns and see things that the meteorologists had missed, calling off jumps minutes before conditions turned dangerous. Whatever it was, it made people curious. And curiosity in a place where everyone had too much downtime and not enough interesting things to think about could turn into something uglier. She didn't look particularly impressive. Average height, lean build from years of physical work, hands that showed calluses in specific places from handling parachute cord and rigging hardware. Her flight suit was regulation civilian contractor. Gray, sleeves rolled up because the hangar was already sweltering despite the early hour. Safety glasses hung around her neck on a lanyard that had seen actual use, and a clipboard with morning safety checklists was clipped to her belt like a badge of office. But it was her arms that told the real story if you knew how to read the signs. Burn scars along her left forearm in a pattern that looked too precise to be accidental. Small white marks on her knuckles that could have been from parachute cord under tension. And running from her wrist to her elbow, a series of thin surgical scars that formed an almost geometric pattern, like someone had needed to reconstruct bone and muscle with mathematical precision. Most people noticed the scars eventually, but few asked about them. David Kim, the chief civilian flight instructor, had wondered about them during her first week, but figured everyone deserved their privacy. Lisa Torres, the only other female instructor on the team, had asked once if they hurt in cold weather. Maria had just said not anymore and left it at that. The morning briefing was standard procedure. Weather conditions, wind patterns, aircraft status, emergency protocols. Maria sat in the back row of folding chairs, taking notes with the methodical attention of someone who'd learned that details could save lives. The jump schedule was straightforward. Basic airborne training for a group of new airmen, standard altitude of 3,000 feet, textbook conditions for learning the fundamentals. When Master Sergeant Williams announced the altitude and aircraft assignments, Maria raised her hand quietly. "I'll need to pass on this one, Sergeant. Not my operational parameters." The room went quiet. It wasn't unusual for instructors to skip certain jumps based on specialization or scheduling, but Maria's reason was different. Everyone knew she only jumped from high altitude, minimum 10,000 feet, preferably higher. It had been that way since her first day, and she'd never explained why. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, fresh from his promotion and full of the confidence that came with new rank, turned around in his chair. "What's the matter, Santos? Afraid of getting close to the ground?" A few chuckles rippled through the room. Morrison was popular with the younger airmen, all swagger and aviation stories, the kind of leader who commanded attention through volume and personality. He'd been making comments about Maria's altitude restrictions for months, but always just shy of direct insubordination. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maria didn't respond, just made a note on her clipboard and waited for the briefing to continue. But Morrison wasn't finished. "Seriously, what kind of jump instructor is scared of low altitude? That's like being a driving instructor who won't get on the highway." More laughter now, louder and more confident. Corporal Ryan Fletcher, who followed Morrison's lead in most things, jumped in. "Maybe she's got vertigo or something. Can't handle looking down when you're too close to the ground." Private Emma Walsh, new to the base and eager to fit in with the group, added her own observation. "I heard she's never done a combat jump, only high-altitude civilian stuff. Probably doesn't know how to handle real military operations." Maria continued taking notes, her expression unchanged. She'd heard worse from better people, and these comments were just noise compared to the real challenges she'd faced. But Master Sergeant Williams was starting to look uncomfortable. Caught between maintaining discipline and avoiding conflict with instructors, he needed to keep the training schedule running smoothly. The briefing ended with assignments and safety reminders, and most of the group filed out toward the aircraft. Maria packed her equipment methodically, checking and double-checking items that she'd verified twice already that morning. It was a ritual that some people mistook for nervousness, but anyone who understood precision work would recognize as professional thoroughness. Morrison lingered near the equipment lockers, ostensibly organizing his gear, but really waiting for an opportunity to continue the conversation. "You know, Santos, it's kind of unfair to the students. They're paying for instruction from someone who's supposed to know all aspects of parachuting, not just the easy stuff." Maria looked up from her equipment check. "Low altitude isn't my specialty. You want someone who might miss something important, or someone who knows their limitations. I want someone who's actually qualified to teach military parachuting," Morrison shot back. "This isn't some weekend skydiving club. These are airmen who might need to jump into combat someday." Fletcher nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. What if they're in a situation where they need to jump from 2,000 feet? They going to learn that from someone who's afraid to go below 10,000? The equipment bay had filled with other instructors and students preparing for the morning jumps, and the conversation was starting to draw attention. Lisa Torres was packing her reserve chute nearby, close enough to hear but trying to stay focused on her own preparations. David Kim was reviewing weather updates on his tablet, but his occasional glances suggested he was monitoring the situation. Maria finished her equipment check and stood up, adjusting the straps on her gear bag. If you have concerns about my qualifications, Sergeant, you should take them up with Master Sergeant Williams. I'm sure he can review my certifications with you." But Morrison was warming to his theme, encouraged by the audience and the lack of pushback. Certifications are just paper. What matters is actual experience. And from where I'm sitting, looks like your experience has some pretty big gaps in it. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Other conversations in the hangar were starting to quiet as people tuned into the developing confrontation. Walsh stepped closer, emboldened by Morrison's confidence. "I mean, what kind of military background only teaches you to jump from cruising? Altitude? Sounds like civilian training trying to pass itself off as something more serious." Maria set down her gear bag and faced them directly. For the first time since the conversation started, she gave them her complete attention. Not angry, not defensive, just focused in a way that changed the temperature of the room. "You think high altitude is easier?" she asked, her voice calm as desert air before a storm. Morrison smirked. "I think high altitude gives you a lot more time to fix mistakes. Low altitude is where you find out who really knows what they're doing. And I think," Fletcher added, gaining confidence, "that someone who won't do low altitude work might be hiding the fact that they can't do low altitude work." The accusation was clear now, and the equipment bay had gone quiet enough that everyone could hear what came next. Maria studied Morrison for a moment, then looked around at the faces watching the confrontation. Some curious, some uncomfortable, all waiting to see how she'd respond to having her competence questioned in front of her colleagues and students. "You want to know why I don't jump below 10,000 feet?" she asked quietly. "Hell yes," Morrison said, sensing victory. "Enlighten us." But before Maria could respond, they heard footsteps on the hangar floor. Measured, authoritative steps that cut through the background noise of aircraft engines and equipment preparation. The sound made everyone in the equipment bay stop what they were doing and look toward the main entrance. General Patricia Rodriguez walked into that hangar like she owned not just the building, but the desert it sat on. Not tall, but solid as granite, with silver haircut regulation, short and brown eyes that had seen combat from the ground up. Her flight suit was pressed sharp despite the early hour, and the stars on her collar caught the fluorescent lights like signals from a different world. Rodriguez had been reviewing quarterly training reports in her office when her aide mentioned there might be a situation developing in Hangar 7, something about civilian contractor harassment that was escalating beyond normal workplace friction. She'd planned to send someone else to handle it, but something about the aide's tone suggested this needed command attention. Now seeing the scene in front of her, a group of junior NCOs crowding around a lone civilian contractor while questioning her qualifications, she understood why her instincts had been correct. The general didn't announce herself, didn't ask for explanations, just walked straight to where Maria stood and positioned herself next to her. Not in front, not behind, but beside her, like they were teammates who'd worked together before. The silence that followed was the kind that made people examine their life choices. Rodriguez let it stretch until it became uncomfortable, then spoke in the voice that had commanded respect from Afghanistan to the Pentagon. "Which one of you brilliant tactical minds wants to explain to me why you're questioning the qualifications of someone whose jump record you've never seen?" Nobody answered. Morrison was staring at his boots like they contained the secrets of military strategy. Fletcher had suddenly discovered a fascinating flaw in the hangar wall. Walsh looked like she was trying to disappear into her own uniform. Rodriguez waited with the patience of someone who'd spent years dealing with subordinates who confused volume with authority. When no volunteers emerged, she continued, "No takers? That's interesting. You all seemed pretty confident a minute ago." She reached into her flight suit and pulled out a manila folder with classification stamps that most of the people in that hangar had never seen before. "See, here's what you don't understand about Maria Santos. You think high-altitude jumping is the easy option. You think someone who won't go below 10,000 feet is playing it safe. Rodriguez opened the folder just enough to reference the contents without revealing classified material. Operation Ghostfall, 2012 through 2014, Joint Special Operations Command, High Altitude Reconnaissance and Infiltration. Jumps from 25,000 feet into hostile territory with zero margin for error and no backup extraction. Morrison made a choking sound. The color drained from Fletcher's face like water from a broken tank. Walsh stared at the general with the expression of someone who just realized they'd been mocking a legend. "Hello, Jumps," Rodriguez continued, her voice never rising above conversational level. "High altitude, low opening. Behind enemy lines where the slightest mistake meant capture, torture, or death. Oxygen-starved air, equipment that had to work perfectly in sub-zero temperatures, landing zones marked by GPS coordinates and hope." She closed the folder and looked around the room, making sure she had everyone's attention. 12-person teams, rotating assignments, operations so classified that most people with clearance don't know they happened. Maria was the lead rigger and primary jump coordinator, responsible for equipment that had to work flawlessly at altitudes where commercial aircraft struggled to fly. The hangar had gone so quiet you could hear the air conditioning cycling, the distant sound of aircraft engines warming up on the tarmac, the soft whisper of wind through the open bay doors. "The unit lasted 3 years," Rodriguez continued, her voice carrying the weight of memory and classified history. 43 confirmed operations, 38 successful extractions, 17 infrastructure reconnaissance missions that prevented major attacks on coalition forces, 0 equipment failures. She paused, letting those numbers settle into the consciousness of everyone listening. 15 personnel served across all rotations. 11 made it home. The other 4 died doing jumps that no one was supposed to survive, from altitudes that commercial skydivers consider impossible, into territory so hostile that their missions were automatically classified as suicide runs. Rodriguez looked directly at Morrison, who was now pale as desert sand. "She doesn't jump below 10,000 feet because that's not what she was trained for. She was trained for the impossible." Part 2. The weight of recognition. Rodriguez's words hung in the air like smoke from ordnance, heavy and impossible to ignore. Maria stood perfectly still, her expression unchanged, but something in her posture suggested she was remembering things she'd rather forget. The general's revelation had transformed the atmosphere in the hangar from casual workplace friction to something far more serious, something that carried the weight of classified operations and lives lost in places that didn't exist on official maps. Morrison tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like he was drowning in air that had suddenly become too thick to breathe. The swagger that had defined his personality for months had evaporated, leaving behind a junior NCO who was beginning to understand that he'd just questioned the credentials of someone whose worst day at work would have been beyond his imagination. Fletcher stood frozen beside him, his earlier confidence replaced by the pale realization that he'd been mocking a ghost, someone whose existence in official records was probably limited to a few lines of heavily redacted text. Walsh, the newest member of their group, looked like she was trying to process information that didn't fit into any category she understood. The military had taught her about different types of jumps, different types of operations, different levels of classification, but this was something else entirely. This was the kind of operation that existed in the spaces between official doctrine, where normal rules didn't apply and survival depended on skills that couldn't be taught in any classroom. David Kim, the civilian flight instructor who'd been trying to stay neutral, found himself staring at Maria with new understanding. He'd worked with military contractors for years, had seen the difference between weekend warriors and people with real experience, but he'd never encountered someone whose background was this deeply buried. The precision he'd noticed in her work, the methodical way she approached every task, The quiet confidence that never needed to announce itself suddenly made perfect sense. Lisa Torres had stopped pretending to organize her equipment and was listening with the focused attention of someone who understood that she was hearing history that most people would never know existed. As the only other woman in the instructor group, she'd been watching Maria navigate the casual sexism and professional skepticism that came with being female in a male-dominated field. Now she realized that Maria had been dealing with something far more complex than gender dynamics, carrying secrets that would have crushed most people under their weight. Master Sergeant Williams emerged from his office, drawn by the unusual silence that had replaced the normal bustle of pre-flight preparation. He'd been expecting to find the typical organized chaos of jump preparation, instructors checking equipment, and students going through final briefings. Instead, he found a tableau that looked like someone had pressed pause on reality, everyone frozen in place while a general stood next to a civilian contractor with a classified folder in her hands. The folder itself was a study in bureaucratic menace, thick with documents that bore classification stamps Williams recognized, but had never seen in person. Top Secret was visible on the cover, along with compartmentalization codes that indicated information so sensitive that even knowing it existed required special clearance. The fact that Rodriguez had brought it to a routine training facility suggested that whatever was happening here had moved far beyond normal workplace conflict. Maria finally spoke, her voice carrying none of the defensiveness that might have been expected from someone whose past had just been exposed. General, that information was compartmentalized for good reasons. These people don't need to carry that weight. Rodriguez looked at her with something that might have been respect or might have been recognition of shared burden. They made it necessary when they questioned your qualifications. Sometimes classification has to give way to education. The exchange revealed layers of complexity that went beyond simple military hierarchy. These were two professionals who understood the cost of secrets, the weight of operations that couldn't be discussed in normal channels, the burden of carrying responsibility for things that had to remain hidden from the people they'd been protecting. Their conversation had the efficiency of people who'd learned to communicate essential information without wasting words, a skill developed in environments where brevity could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Morrison found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Ma'am, we didn't know. We were just asking about training protocols." Rodriguez turned her attention to him with the kind of focus that made seasoned officers uncomfortable. "No, Sergeant, you weren't asking about protocols. You were questioning competence based on assumptions. You were mocking someone whose experience you couldn't begin to understand." She opened the folder again, this time revealing a photograph that showed a landscape of mountains and snow, terrain so hostile that it looked like another planet. Afghanistan, 2013. Winter operations above 20,000 feet. Temperatures that would kill you in minutes without proper equipment. Winds that could slam you into a mountainside before you had time to think about correcting course. The photograph was in black and white, but the desolation was clear even without color. Jagged peaks that disappeared into clouds. Valleys that looked like knife cuts in the earth. Terrain where a mistake in navigation would mean dying alone in a place where no one would ever find your body. It was the kind of landscape that existed in nightmares and classified briefings, territory that normal people saw only in satellite imagery and intelligence reports. Intelligence suggested a high-value target was using a facility in this region for weapons coordination. Satellite surveillance was impossible due to weather patterns. Ground insertion was ruled out because of the terrain and hostile presence. The only option was high-altitude reconnaissance with extremely limited time on target. Rodriguez looked around the hangar, making sure everyone understood the impossibility of what she was describing. Jump altitude, 25,000 feet. Target altitude, 18,000 feet. Weather conditions, blizzard with winds gusting to 80 miles per hour. Visibility, effectively zero. Landing zone, approximately 200 meters square, surrounded by terrain that would kill you if you missed by 50 feet in any direction. Fletcher made a sound that might have been a sob or might have been recognition of how far out of his depth he'd been swimming. The numbers Rodriguez was citing weren't just difficult, they were beyond the parameters of normal human survival. Commercial aircraft flew at 35,000 feet, but they were pressurized and heated. Military aircraft rarely operated in the conditions she was describing, and when they did, it was with extensive support systems and multiple backup plans. Standard protocol, Rodriguez continued, would have been to abort the mission. Weather conditions exceeded safety parameters by factors. That made the operation technically impossible. But intelligence indicated that waiting would mean losing the target and potentially dozens of coalition lives. She turned a page in the folder, revealing technical specifications that looked like engineering documents mixed with medical charts. Maria redesigned the standard equipment package to function at altitudes and temperatures where normal gear would fail. Modified oxygen systems, cold weather rigging that could handle extreme wind loads, navigation equipment that could function in electromagnetic conditions that would scramble normal GPS. The technical complexity of what Rodriguez was describing was starting to sink in. Maria hadn't just participated in an impossible mission, she'd engineered the technology that made it possible. The skills required went far beyond normal military training, combining aerospace engineering, survival physiology, and operational planning at a level that existed only in the most classified programs. Walsh finally found her voice, though it came out small and uncertain. Did the mission succeed? Rodriguez looked at Maria, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Target was confirmed and eliminated. Intelligence gathered prevented 3 separate attacks on coalition bases. Maria's equipment modifications became standard for high-altitude operations across multiple special operations units. But the general's expression suggested that success had come at a cost that couldn't be measured in simple mission parameters. The jump itself was survivable only because Maria had calculated wind patterns, equipment loads, and descent trajectories with mathematical precision that left no margin for error. She jumped first, established the landing zone, guided in 2 other team members using equipment she'd designed specifically for those conditions. Rodriguez paused, looking directly at Morrison. Temperature at landing, -40 degrees. Fahrenheit. Wind speed, sustained 60 miles per hour with gusts to 85. Visibility, less than 10 feet. She had to establish position markers and communication relay, while functioning in conditions that would incapacitate most people within minutes. The silence that followed was different from before, weighted not just with shock, but with growing understanding of how far their assumptions had been from reality. They'd been mocking someone who'd survived conditions that would have killed them before they hit the ground, someone whose worst training day had involved more real danger than they'd face in their entire careers. David Kim was the first to speak, his voice carrying the professional respect of someone who understood technical complexity. The equipment modifications you mentioned, were they incorporated into standard training protocols? Maria answered. This time, her voice steady but carrying undertones of memory that suggested complicated feelings about recognition. Some of them. The oxygen systems are now standard for operations above 20,000 feet. The cold weather rigging is used in Arctic training. The navigation modifications were classified beyond my clearance level. It was a careful answer, revealing enough to satisfy curiosity while maintaining operational security. But it also revealed the strange position Maria occupied, someone who'd contributed to military capability at the highest levels, while remaining officially invisible in the systems that would normally recognize such contributions. Part 3. The cost of excellence. The morning sun had climbed higher while they'd been talking, turning the hangar into a furnace despite the air conditioning that struggled against the Nevada heat. But the temperature inside seemed secondary to the emotional climate that had developed around Rodriguez's revelations. What had started as casual workplace mockery had evolved into something that felt more like a military tribunal, with Maria as both defendant and expert witness in a case about the nature of competence and the danger of assumptions. Rodriguez closed the folder and looked around the hangar with the expression of someone who was deciding how much truth a situation could handle. The reason Maria doesn't jump below 10,000 feet isn't fear or limitation. It's specialization. When you've spent years calculating survival parameters for impossible conditions, standard operations feel like unnecessary risks with insufficient margin for error. This was a perspective that none of the junior personnel had considered. The idea that someone could be overqualified for normal operations in a way that made them seem underqualified to people who didn't understand the difference between difficult and impossible. Maria's refusal to participate in low-altitude training wasn't about avoiding challenge. It was about applying standards developed in environments where miscalculation meant death. Morrison was struggling with cognitive dissonance, trying to reconcile the woman he'd been mocking with the operational history Rodriguez had described. "Ma'am, if her qualifications are so extensive, why is she working as a civilian contractor? Why not active duty with appropriate rank and recognition?" It was a reasonable question, but Rodriguez's expression suggested it touched on complexities that went beyond simple career decisions. Because operations like Ghostfall don't exist in normal military structure. Personnel who serve in compartmentalized programs often find that their experience doesn't translate to conventional career paths. She looked at Maria, who nodded slightly, giving permission for further explanation. When your specialty is operations that can't be acknowledged, your service record becomes a collection of gaps and classifications. Promotion requires documentation that can't be provided. Recognition requires publicity that would compromise ongoing operations. The institutional irony was becoming clear. The military had trained Maria for operations beyond normal human capability, then created a bureaucratic structure that couldn't acknowledge her achievements or utilize her skills within standard frameworks. She'd become too valuable for normal service and too classified for normal recognition, trapped in a space between official military structure and the shadow operations that required her expertise. Fletcher was beginning to understand the personal cost of the career path Rodriguez was describing. So she's working civilian contracts because her military experience is too classified to be officially recognized? Among other reasons, Rodriguez replied, but also because civilian contractors have flexibility that active duty personnel don't. Maria can choose assignments based on technical requirements rather than bureaucratic convenience. She can apply her skills where they're most needed without navigating command structures that don't understand what she's capable of. Lisa Torres had been listening with growing appreciation for the complexity of Maria's position. As someone who'd also chosen civilian contractor status after military service, she understood the trade-offs between flexibility and recognition, between professional autonomy and institutional support. But Maria's situation was more extreme, involving skills and experience that existed in categories most people couldn't imagine. The downside, Rodriguez continued, is that civilian contractors don't have the institutional protection that comes with rank and official recognition. They're vulnerable to exactly the kind of questioning we witnessed here, from people who assume that civilian status indicates inferior capability. Master Sergeant Williams was processing implications that went beyond the immediate situation. As facility supervisor, he was responsible for maintaining training standards and personnel management, but he was realizing that he'd been managing someone whose qualifications existed in dimensions he hadn't known to consider. Maria's personnel file probably contained standard contractor documentation, but nothing that would indicate the depth of her background or the significance of her restrictions. "Ma'am," Williams said carefully, "are there operational security Considerations we should be aware of regarding Miss Santos's assignment here. Rodriguez considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Nothing that affects day-to-day operations. But it's worth understanding that Maria's presence here isn't coincidental. High-altitude training programs benefit from expertise that exists only in specialized communities. Her assignment serves multiple purposes. This revelation added another layer to the situation, suggesting that Maria's position at Nellis wasn't just employment, but continuation of service in a different form. The military was utilizing her expertise while maintaining the classification boundaries that protected operational security, creating an arrangement that served institutional needs while acknowledging individual capabilities. Walsh was struggling with the implications of everything she'd heard. I keep thinking about what we said about combat jumps, about her not having experience with real military operations. Rodriguez's expression became more serious, if that was possible. That perspective demonstrates exactly why classification exists. The assumption that visible service represents the totality of military experience. The belief that conventional operations define the limits of military capability. She opened the folder to a page covered with technical diagrams that looked like engineering schematics mixed with medical charts. The operations Maria participated in weren't combat in any conventional sense. They were reconnaissance missions that required surviving in environments where combat would have been impossible, where the primary enemy was physics and weather rather than hostile forces. The diagram showed equipment configurations that looked more like spacesuit designs than standard military gear. Systems engineered for survival in conditions that existed at the margins of human capability. Oxygen recycling systems, thermoregulation equipment, navigation tools that could function in electromagnetic environments that would disable normal GPS, communication gear designed to work across distances and terrain that would defeat standard radio systems. But the technical challenges were only part of the equation, Rodriguez continued. The psychological requirements were equally demanding. Jumping into complete unknown, landing in territory where rescue was impossible, functioning alone for extended periods while maintaining operational effectiveness. Maria spoke for the first time since Rodriguez had begun her explanation, her voice carrying undertones that suggested complicated relationships with memory. The hardest part wasn't the technical challenges or the physical conditions. It was the knowledge that if something went wrong, no one would ever know what happened to you. This admission revealed dimensions of the experience that went beyond technical accomplishment, touching on psychological pressures that existed only in operations where personnel were completely isolated from support systems. The courage required wasn't just physical bravery in the face of danger, but psychological resilience in the face of absolute solitude and responsibility. Fletcher was beginning to grasp the magnitude of what they'd been mocking. When you say no one would know what happened, you mean officially? Like families wouldn't be told? Rodriguez and Maria exchanged a look that carried years of shared understanding about the costs of classified service. Families of personnel in compartmentalized operations receive standard notification if something happens. Training accident, equipment failure, administrative casualty. The real mission never becomes part of official records. The institutional cruelty of this arrangement was becoming apparent. People who died performing impossible missions in service of national security became administrative footnotes, their sacrifices hidden behind classification barriers that protected operational security while denying recognition to the individuals who'd made ultimate sacrifices. Morrison was finally beginning to understand the scope of his mistake. "Ma'am, when we questioned her qualifications, we weren't just being disrespectful. We were questioning someone whose service was beyond anything we could understand." "Exactly," Rodriguez replied. "And that's why this conversation was necessary. Not to embarrass anyone or to reveal classified information unnecessarily, but to provide context that should inform future interactions. She looked around the hangar, making sure her next words reached everyone who'd been part of the original confrontation. Military service takes many forms. Some of it is visible, documented, recognized through normal channels. Some of it exists in spaces between official acknowledgement, requiring sacrifice that can't be publicly honored. Part 4. The Hidden Mathematics of Survival. Rodriguez turned to a page in the folder that contained what looked like meteorological data mixed with ballistic calculations, numbers and charts that represented the difference between theoretical possibility and actual survival. Afghanistan, January 2013. Target intelligence. Suggested enemy coordination facility at 18,000 feet elevation. Mountain terrain, winter conditions that made normal approach impossible. She traced a finger along a topographical map that showed terrain so hostile it looked like a relief model of hell. Valleys that cut through mountains like knife wounds, peaks that disappeared into cloud cover, ridgelines that formed natural barriers against any conventional approach. The target location was marked with coordinates that placed it in territory where even specialized mountain warfare units would struggle to operate. Weather window, 72 hours maximum. After that, seasonal. Storms would make the region inaccessible for months. Ground approach, ruled out due to hostile presence in terrain that would require weeks of movement through territory under enemy observation. The operational constraints Rodriguez was describing represented impossible mathematics, variables that couldn't be reconciled through normal military planning. The target was inaccessible by conventional means, located in terrain where normal rules of engagement didn't apply, protected by weather conditions that would kill most people before they could complete their mission. Standard high altitude. Reconnaissance equipment was inadequate for the environmental conditions. Oxygen systems designed for normal operational altitudes would fail in the thin air and extreme cold. Navigation equipment would be unreliable due to electromagnetic interference from the terrain and weather patterns. Maria interrupted, her voice carrying the technical precision of someone who'd solved problems that existed at the margins of physical possibility. Standard military GPS becomes unreliable above certain altitudes in mountainous terrain. The satellite geometry creates shadows where position accuracy degrades beyond operational usefulness. This was expertise that existed in narrow technical specialties, knowledge that combined aerospace engineering with survival physiology and operational planning. Maria hadn't just participated in impossible missions. She'd engineered solutions to problems that most people couldn't even formulate properly. Rodriguez continued reading from technical specifications that looked like they'd been written by engineers working at the limits of known science. Temperature at target altitude, -35 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill factors that would create effective temperatures below -60. Wind speeds, sustained 40 miles per hour with gusts to 70. Visibility, variable from 0 to 50 feet depending on snow conditions. David Kim was following the technical discussion with professional interest, trying to understand how anyone could plan survival in conditions that would defeat normal equipment and training. The equipment modifications you mentioned, how did you develop solutions for conditions that extreme? Maria's answer revealed thinking that operated at levels beyond normal military training. You start with baseline human survival requirements and work backwards from mission parameters. Oxygen consumption at altitude, thermal regulation in extreme cold, navigation accuracy in degraded conditions, communication reliability across terrain that blocks normal radio propagation. She paused, looking at technical diagrams that represented months of engineering work condensed into operational equipment. Then you test everything under laboratory conditions that simulate the worst-case scenarios. Modify based on failure analysis. Test again until the equipment works reliably in conditions where failure means death. Rodriguez added context that revealed the institutional support behind Maria's innovations. The equipment development was conducted in partnership with aerospace contractors and university research programs. The testing protocols were developed using environmental chambers that could simulate conditions at the margins of human survival. This revelation provided insight into the scale of resources that had been devoted to making impossible missions feasible. Maria's work hadn't been improvised field modifications, but systematic engineering development, backed by institutional resources that existed only for the most critical operational requirements. Fletcher was trying to understand the timeline of development and deployment. How long did the equipment development take? How did you test solutions for conditions that extreme? 18 months from initial requirements to operational deployment, Maria replied. Testing was conducted in stages, starting with computer modeling, then environmental chamber testing, then limited field trials in extreme conditions. Rodriguez pulled out photographs that showed testing environments that looked more like space exploration than military training. Personnel in environmental suits working in chambers that could simulate the atmospheric conditions on high mountains. Equipment testing that involves systematically destroying gear under controlled conditions to understand failure modes. The testing protocols were as dangerous as the actual missions, Rodriguez said. Understanding how equipment fails in extreme conditions requires exposing it to those conditions, which means creating laboratory environments that could kill you if something went wrong. Walsh was beginning to appreciate the depth of preparation that had gone into missions she was only now learning existed. The people who participated in the testing, were they volunteers from special operations units? Maria's expression suggested complicated feelings about the selection process. Some were. Others were engineers and technicians who understood that theoretical solutions had to be validated under real conditions. The line between research and operations became blurred when you're developing equipment for impossible missions. This admission revealed another dimension of Maria's background, suggesting that her role had involved not just operational deployment, but participation in the research and development process that made the missions possible. She'd been both engineer and operator, someone who understood the technology from design principles through field application. Morrison was struggling to reconcile his understanding of military hierarchy with the picture of cross-functional expertise. Rodriguez was describing, "Ma'am, this level of technical development, was it conducted within normal military command structure?" Rodriguez's answer revealed institutional complexities that existed beyond conventional military organization. Programs like Ghostfall operate in spaces between normal command structures. They require resources and expertise that don't exist within single service branches. Coordination between military and civilian research communities, oversight that balances operational security with technical innovation. She looked around the hangar, making sure everyone understood the implications of what she was describing. Maria's role required clearance levels that don't exist in normal military classification systems. Technical expertise that crosses multiple engineering disciplines, operational experience that could only be gained through participation in missions. That officially didn't happen. Part 5. The Weight of Impossible Choices. Rodriguez turned to a section of the folder that contained what appeared to be mission reports. Documents with large sections blacked out by classification redactions, but enough visible text to suggest operations that existed beyond normal military doctrine. January 15, 2013. Weather conditions degraded beyond forecast parameters. Wind speeds increased to sustained 65 miles per hour with gusts exceeding 85. Visibility reduced to 0 due to ground blizzard conditions. The mission parameters she was describing represented a decision point where normal military procedure would have required mission abort, where safety protocols would have demanded waiting for better conditions. But the context of enemy intelligence and strategic timing had created a situation where delay wasn't an option. Intelligence suggested the target would be evacuated within 48 hours. Seasonal weather patterns indicated that after the current storm system, the region would be inaccessible for 3 months. Mission postponement would mean losing the target and the intelligence opportunity. Maria spoke quietly, her voice carrying the weight of decisions that had consequences beyond individual survival. Command gave us the option to abort. Made it clear that mission continuation was entirely voluntary, that no one would question. A decision to wait for better conditions. This admission revealed the psychological complexity of operations where personnel were given choice about participating in missions that exceeded safety parameters. The decision to continue wasn't commanded from above, but emerged from individual assessment of risk versus mission importance, creating responsibility that extended beyond normal military obedience. Rodriguez continued reading from mission documentation that revealed minute-by-minute decision-making under impossible conditions. 0300 hours. Team leader reported wind conditions at upper limits of equipment tolerance. 315 hours. Navigation team confirmed GPS degradation due to atmospheric interference. 330 hours. Medical officer advised that survival time on target would be reduced to maximum 90 minutes due to temperature and wind combination. Each timestamp represented a decision point where the mission could have been aborted, where reasonable. Military judgment would have suggested retreat and reconsideration. But the accumulation of intelligence requirements and strategic timing had created momentum that carried the operation forward despite degrading conditions. 0345 hours. Team voted unanimously to continue mission despite conditions exceeding all safety parameters. The use of voted was significant, suggesting operational democracy that existed only in specialized units where individual expertise was too valuable to subordinate to traditional military hierarchy. These were decisions made by professionals who understood both the technical challenges and the strategic implications, choosing to continue based on informed assessment rather than external command. Fletcher was trying to understand decision-making processes that operated beyond his training and experience. When you say voted, you mean the team had authority to overrule safety protocols. Rodriguez looked at Maria, who nodded slightly before responding. In compartmentalized operations, team leaders have discretionary authority that doesn't exist in conventional military structure. When you're operating beyond normal support systems, traditional command and control becomes impossible. This revelation provided insight into operational flexibility that existed only at the highest levels of military capability, where personnel were trusted with decision-making authority that reflected their expertise and the impossibility of receiving guidance from conventional command structures. Maria continued, her voice carrying undertones of memory that suggested complicated feelings about the choices they'd made. The vote wasn't casual democracy. It was professional assessment by people who understood both the technical requirements and the strategic importance. Everyone knew exactly what we were choosing. Rodriguez added context that revealed the institutional framework behind such decisions. Personnel selected for compartmentalized operations undergo psychological evaluation that assesses decision-making capability under extreme conditions. The authority to continue or abort missions is granted only to individuals who've demonstrated judgment that balances mission requirements with survival probability. David Kim was following the discussion with growing appreciation for operational complexity that existed beyond normal civilian understanding. The psychological pressure of making those decisions. How do you prepare for that kind of responsibility? Maria's answer revealed training that extended far beyond technical skills. Psychological preparation involves simulation exercises, where you practice making life and death decisions under time pressure. You learn to assess probability, weigh strategic importance against survival chances, make choices that you'll have to live with regardless of outcome. This admission touched on dimensions of military training that existed only in the most specialized programs. Preparation for decision-making that combined technical analysis with moral responsibility under conditions where normal support systems weren't available. Rodriguez pulled out a map that showed the route from drop zone to target, a path that wound through terrain so hostile it looked like a diagram of systematic impossibility. Elevation changes that would challenge experienced mountaineers, weather exposure that would test survival equipment beyond design parameters, navigation challenges that would defeat normal GPS systems. Distance from drop zone to target, 2-3 kilometers. Elevation gain, 1,800 feet. Terrain, mixed ice and rock with slopes exceeding 60 degrees in multiple sections. Estimated travel time under normal conditions, 4 hours. Estimated travel time under mission conditions, 8 hours minimum. The numbers revealed a journey that existed at the margins of human capability, requiring not just technical climbing skills, but navigation accuracy and physical endurance under conditions that would defeat most people before they reached their objective. Morrison was beginning to understand the scope of physical and technical challenges the mission had involved. The climbing equipment was that standard military gear or specialized for the conditions. Maria's answer revealed another dimension of the technical preparation. Specialized equipment developed specifically for high-altitude operations in extreme conditions. Ice axes designed for temperatures where standard steel would become brittle. Rope systems that could function when exposed to conditions that would destroy normal climbing gear. Rodriguez added documentation that showed equipment specifications that looked more like aerospace engineering than normal military hardware. Testing protocols required exposing equipment to temperature and stress conditions that would simulate worst-case mission parameters. Multiple equipment failures during testing phase led to design modifications that became standard for subsequent operations. This revelation provided insight into the iterative engineering process that had been required to make impossible missions feasible. Systematic testing and modification cycles that ensured equipment reliability under conditions that existed at the limits of material science. Lisa Torres was trying to understand the timeline between equipment development and operational deployment. The specialized equipment, was it available for training, or did you first use it during actual missions? Maria's expression suggested complicated relationships with training protocols that existed outside normal military structure. Training was conducted using production equipment under conditions that simulated mission parameters as closely as possible without creating unnecessary risk. But the final validation of equipment and procedures could only happen during actual operations. This admission revealed another dimension of the operational challenge, suggesting that personnel were deploying with equipment that had been tested extensively but hadn't been validated under actual mission conditions. The first use of critical survival equipment happened during operations where failure would mean death. Walsh was struggling with the implications of operating with unproven equipment in impossible conditions. How do you maintain confidence in equipment that hasn't been tested under real conditions? Rodriguez answered with institutional perspective that revealed military thinking about acceptable risk and operational necessity. Confidence comes from understanding the engineering principles, the testing protocols, and the margin of safety built into the equipment design. But ultimately, operations like Ghostfall require accepting risk levels that exist beyond normal safety parameters. She looked around the hangar, making sure everyone understood the psychological dimensions of what she was describing. The personnel selected for these operations had to demonstrate not just technical competence, but psychological resilience in the face of uncertainty. The ability to function effectively when normal safety systems weren't available. Part 6. The Mathematics of Death. Rodriguez opened to a page that contained atmospheric data charts intersected with human physiology graphs, the kind of scientific documentation that reduced survival to mathematical equations. The numbers were stark, unforgiving calculations that showed exactly where human capability ended and death began. At 25,000 feet, atmospheric pressure drops to approximately 25% of sea level. Oxygen partial pressure becomes insufficient to sustain consciousness without supplemental systems. The technical specifications she was reading represented the boundary between the possible and the fatal, measurements that defined exactly how little margin for error existed in the operations Maria had conducted. Each number was a constraint that had to be overcome through engineering precision, or accepted as a limitation that could kill you if miscalculated. Time of useful consciousness at that altitude without supplemental oxygen, approximately 3 minutes. For a healthy adult under ideal conditions. In combat stress situations with elevated heart rate and oxygen consumption, useful consciousness time drops to under 90 seconds. Maria interrupted with the kind of detail that came from first-hand experience with systems failure. Those numbers assume optimal physiological conditions. Cold stress, physical exertion, equipment malfunction, any variable that increases oxygen demand or decreases supply efficiency can cut survival time by half or more. This was knowledge gained through experience that existed at the margins of human survival. Understanding that came from operating in environments where theoretical calculations met real-world variables that could kill you faster than textbooks suggested. Maria had learned these limitations not from classroom study but from calculating survival under conditions where miscalculation meant death. Rodriguez continued with environmental data that painted a picture of systematic hostility beyond normal human experience. Surface temperature at target elevation during mission window, -38 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chill factor with sustained winds of 65 miles per hour created effective temperature of -75 degrees Fahrenheit. The numbers were moving beyond uncomfortable into ranges that represented immediate threats to human survival. Exposed skin would suffer frostbite damage within minutes. Breathing would become painful and then dangerous. Equipment would begin failing in ways that no amount of preparation could completely prevent. Fletcher was trying to understand physiological challenges that existed beyond his training. The temperature conditions. How do you maintain manual dexterity for technical tasks when it's that cold? Maria's answer revealed preparation that extended into every detail of human performance under extreme conditions. Specialized hand warmers that use chemical heating elements. Glove systems with multiple layers that can be removed for fine motor tasks. Training exercises that practice technical procedures while hands are deliberately cooled to simulate field conditions. But her expression suggested that preparation could only go so far when confronting physics that didn't accommodate human limitations. Even with the best equipment, you're operating with reduced manual dexterity, slower reaction times, increased fatigue from the energy required just to maintain core body temperature. Rodriguez pulled out medical documentation that showed pre-mission physiological assessments, data that revealed the systematic preparation required to survive in conditions that would incapacitate most people. Personnel selected for high altitude operations undergo medical evaluation that includes altitude chamber testing, cold stress assessment, cardiovascular fitness standards that exceed normal military requirements. The medical standards were revealing another dimension of the selection process, suggesting that participation in these operations required not just training and equipment, but physiological capability that existed only in a small percentage of the population. The human body had to be optimized for survival in conditions that evolution had never prepared it to handle. David Kim was following the technical discussion with professional curiosity about equipment systems that operated beyond normal aviation parameters. The oxygen systems you mentioned, were they similar to what commercial aircraft use for emergency situations? Maria's answer revealed engineering complexity that went far beyond normal aviation safety equipment. Commercial emergency oxygen. Systems are designed for temporary use during descent to safe altitude. Our systems had to provide sustained life support for hours while maintaining operational effectiveness at extreme altitude. She gestured toward technical diagrams that showed breathing apparatus that looked more like spacesuit life support than normal military equipment. Closed-circuit rebreathers with carbon dioxide scrubbing systems. Backup oxygen supplies with redundant delivery mechanisms. Heating elements to prevent freezing of breathing apparatus at extreme temperature. The technical complexity was staggering, representing engineering solutions to problems that existed only at the intersection of human physiology and extreme environmental conditions. Each system had to work perfectly while exposed to conditions that would destroy normal equipment, creating reliability requirements that push technology beyond standard applications. Morrison was beginning to grasp the systematic nature of preparation required for operations that exceeded normal human capability. The training for using this equipment, was that conducted under the same extreme conditions? Rodriguez answered with institutional perspective on training protocols that existed outside normal military structure. Training progression included altitude chamber exposure up to simulated 30,000 feet, cold weather operations training in Alaska during winter conditions, equipment familiarity exercises conducted while wearing full environmental protection gear. But she added context that revealed the limitations of preparation for truly extreme conditions. Complete simulation of mission conditions wasn't possible without creating training situations that were as dangerous as actual operations. Some aspects of equipment performance and human capability could only be validated during real missions. This admission revealed the edge of preparation where training ended and faith in engineering began. The point where systematic preparation gave way to acceptance that some unknowns could only be resolved through actual performance under conditions that allowed no margin for error. Walsh was struggling with the psychological implications of deploying into situations where critical unknowns remained unresolved. How do you maintain operational confidence when you know that some equipment and procedures haven't been fully tested under real conditions? Maria's answer revealed thinking that operated beyond normal risk assessment frameworks. Confidence comes from understanding the engineering principles behind the equipment, trusting the testing that has been possible, and accepting that some level of unknown risk is inherent in operations that push beyond established parameters. Her voice carried undertones that suggested complicated relationships with uncertainty and calculated risk. But you also develop contingency thinking, multiple backup plans for equipment failure, alternative procedures for when primary systems don't work as expected. Rodriguez added documentation that showed contingency planning that covered scenarios ranging from equipment malfunction to complete mission parameter changes during deployment. Each operation included abort criteria, alternative extraction procedures, equipment redundancy that allowed mission continuation even with significant system failures. The contingency planning revealed systematic thinking about failure modes and recovery procedures, preparation that acknowledged the impossibility of preventing all problems while ensuring that problems didn't automatically become fatal situations. Part 7. The Descent into Impossibility. Rodriguez turned to mission documentation that contained minute-by-minute logs of the actual operation, records that transformed abstract planning into real-time decision-making under conditions that would have challenged the most experienced operators. 400 hours. Team insertion via modified C-130 at 27,000 feet. Aircraft operating at maximum service ceiling due to terrain clearance requirements and weather conditions. The insertion altitude was significant, representing flight operations at the limits of aircraft capability in weather conditions that would normally ground all aviation operations. The C-130 was being operated beyond normal parameters, pushing both aircraft and crew into territory where standard Procedures gave way to calculated risks that balanced mission requirements against survival probability. Wind conditions at insertion altitude: sustained 70 miles per hour with gusts exceeding 95 miles per hour. Visibility: 0 due to cloud cover and precipitation. Navigation: GPS degraded due to atmospheric conditions and terrain interference. Each parameter represented a variable that pushed the operation further beyond normal safety boundaries, conditions that would have required mission abort under standard military protocols. But the accumulation of strategic intelligence requirements and operational timing had created circumstances where standard protocols became adequate guidance for decision-making. Maria spoke with the precision of someone who'd made calculations under pressure that allowed no room for error. At insertion altitude in those wind conditions, normal parachute deployment would result in horizontal drift that could carry you miles off target. We were using modified parachute systems designed for controlled descent in high-wind environments. The parachute modifications she mentioned represented another dimension of the technical engineering that had been required to make impossible missions feasible. Standard military parachutes were designed for operation under normal weather conditions, but the environmental parameters of this mission required equipment that could function in conditions that would destroy conventional gear. Rodriguez pulled out technical specifications that showed parachute designs that looked more like aircraft control surfaces than normal fabric canopies. Modified ram air parachutes with reinforced construction, control systems that could function while wearing heavy gloves, deployment mechanisms designed to work reliably at extreme altitude and temperature. The engineering complexity extended beyond individual equipment to integrated systems that had to work together under conditions that would test each component beyond normal design parameters. Parachutes had to deploy reliably in thin air and high winds. Navigation systems had to function with degraded GPS signals. Oxygen equipment had to provide life support while allowing operational effectiveness. Fletcher was trying to understand navigation challenges that existed beyond normal military training. With GPS degraded and zero visibility, how do you maintain course accuracy during descent? Maria's answer revealed navigation techniques that combined traditional skills with modern technology adapted for extreme conditions. Backup navigation systems including barometric altimeters calibrated for local atmospheric conditions, magnetic compass systems designed to function at extreme altitude, dead reckoning techniques that account for wind drift during extended descent. But navigation was complicated by environmental factors that changed during the descent, requiring real-time calculation and adjustment that tested both equipment and human capability. Wind patterns change with altitude. Atmospheric pressure varies with terrain features. Magnetic declination can be affected by geological formations that create local magnetic anomalies. The navigation challenge was revealing itself as a complex problem that required both technical expertise and intuitive understanding of how environmental factors interacted to create conditions that couldn't be fully predicted or compensated for through advanced planning. David Kim was following the technical discussion with appreciation for engineering complexity that exceeded normal aviation requirements. The parachute control systems, were you able to maintain directional control in those wind conditions? Rodriguez answered with technical documentation that showed control authority, calculations under extreme environmental conditions. Parachute control systems provided limited directional capability in wind speeds exceeding design parameters. Control authority decreased as wind speed increased, requiring navigation techniques that worked with wind patterns rather than fighting against them. This admission revealed operational techniques that required understanding weather patterns and atmospheric dynamics at a level that went beyond normal military training. Skills that combined meteorology with aircraft control, theory and practical experience with equipment behavior under extreme conditions. Maria added detail that revealed the minute-by-minute decision-making required during descent. You're constantly calculating wind drift against terrain features, adjusting descent rate to maintain control authority, monitoring equipment status, while navigating by instruments that may or may not be providing accurate information. The operational complexity was becoming clear as a challenge that required simultaneous management of multiple technical systems while making navigation decisions based on incomplete information under environmental conditions that punished every mistake with potentially fatal consequences. Morrison was beginning to understand decision-making requirements that exceeded normal military training. The real-time calculations you're describing, was that individual decision-making or coordinated team navigation? Rodriguez's answer revealed command structure that operated differently from conventional military hierarchy. Team members maintained individual navigation responsibility while sharing information through communication systems designed to function under extreme conditions. Each person was responsible for their own survival while contributing to overall mission navigation. This approach distributed both authority and responsibility in ways that reflected the impossibility of centralized command and control under conditions where communication was unreliable and environmental factors required immediate individual response to changing conditions. Walsh was struggling with communication challenges that she'd never considered. How do you maintain team communication during descent in those weather conditions? Maria's answer revealed another dimension of technical complexity that had to be solved to make team operations possible. Communication systems with extended range capability, noise cancellation designed for wind speeds that would overwhelm normal radio systems, backup communication protocols for when primary systems failed. But communication was complicated by environmental factors that affected radio propagation in ways that couldn't be completely anticipated or compensated for through equipment design. Atmospheric conditions affect radio frequency propagation. Terrain features create shadows where communication becomes impossible. Equipment reliability decreases as temperature and wind stress increase. The communication challenge was revealing itself as another variable that added uncertainty to operations that already existed at the margins of human capability, requiring backup plans and alternative coordination methods for when technology failed under conditions that exceeded design. Parameters. Part 8. The Moment of Truth. Rodriguez opened to a page that contained what appeared to be real-time mission logs, timestamps that recorded decision-making under pressure that would have paralyzed most people. 0445 hours. Team leader reported parachute malfunction in Operative 3. Control lines partially severed, directional control compromised. Descent rate increased beyond safe parameters. The mission log entry represented the moment where careful planning met real-world chaos, where all the preparation and engineering precision confronted the fundamental unpredictability of operating at the limits of human capability. Equipment failure during descent in extreme conditions created scenarios where standard emergency procedures became inadequate for survival. 0446 hours. Operative 3 reported altitude 22,000 feet. Horizontal drift exceeding navigation parameters. Estimated landing zone, approximately 800 meters south of target area. Terrain assessment, unsurvivable. Each timestamp represented decisions that had to be made within minutes, under conditions where delay meant death and wrong choices meant mission failure with strategic consequences that extended beyond individual survival. The accumulated pressure of technical malfunction, environmental hostility, and strategic importance created decision-making requirements that existed beyond normal human experience. Maria spoke with the clinical precision of someone who'd made life and death calculations while descending through conditions that would have killed most people before they could complete their analysis. At 22,000 feet with compromised parachute control, standard emergency procedures recommend immediate emergency landing preparation. But the terrain below was a combination of ice fields and rock formations that would be fatal on impact. The emergency she was describing represented a situation where all available options involved significant probability of death, where survival required choosing between different forms of almost certain failure. Standard training provided procedures for parachute malfunction, but those procedures assumed landing areas that could accommodate emergency descent patterns. Rodriguez continued reading from mission logs that recorded real-time problem solving. Under impossible conditions. 0447 hours, Operative 1 and Operative 2. Modified descent patterns to provide navigation assistance to Operative 3. Formation flying attempted using voice communication and visual signals. The formation flying attempt represented tactical thinking that went beyond individual survival to team coordination, under conditions where normal formation techniques would be impossible. Voice communication in high winds and zero visibility. Visual signals in weather conditions that reduced visibility to near zero. Coordination that required trust and precision that existed only in the most elite military units. Fletcher was trying to understand coordination techniques that exceeded his training and experience. Formation flying during parachute descent in those conditions. How is that even possible? Maria's answer revealed techniques that required both technical skill and intuitive understanding of aerodynamics under extreme conditions. Limited formation control through coordinated descent rate adjustment. Voice communication using radio systems designed for high-noise environments. Visual contact maintained through infrared signaling devices. But she added context that revealed the limitations of coordination under conditions that pushed both equipment and human capability beyond normal parameters. Formation flying in those conditions was more theoretical than practical. You're mostly hoping that voice communication works and that everyone's navigation is accurate enough to prevent collision during descent. The admission revealed the edge of technical capability where systematic training gave way to improvisation and hope, where even the most sophisticated preparation confronted variables that couldn't be controlled through advanced planning or equipment. Design. Rodriguez pulled out technical documentation that showed the decision tree for emergency procedures under extreme conditions, flowcharts that revealed the systematic thinking required when normal emergency protocols became inadequate. For survival. Standard emergency procedures for parachute malfunction assume landing areas with survivable impact characteristics. When those assumptions don't apply, emergency response requires real-time assessment of available options. The decision tree revealed thinking that went beyond normal military emergency procedures. Systematic analysis of survival probability under conditions where all available choices involve significant risk of death. Decision-making frameworks that balanced mission requirements against individual survival in situations where both priorities couldn't be achieved simultaneously. David Kim was following the technical discussion with growing appreciation for problem-solving that operated beyond normal engineering parameters. The real-time decision-making you're describing, was that individual assessment or coordinated team analysis? Maria's answer revealed command structure that distributed both authority and responsibility in ways that reflected the impossibility of centralized control under extreme conditions. Individual assessment of personal survival options combined with team coordination for mission continuation. Everyone was responsible for their own survival while maintaining communication for overall mission success. This approach required trust and competence that existed only in units where individual capability was so high that personal survival decisions could be trusted to contribute to overall mission effectiveness even when coordination was limited by environmental factors. Morrison was beginning to understand decision-making pressure that existed beyond normal military experience. The time pressure for making those decisions. How do you process options quickly enough to implement effective solutions? Rodriguez answered with institutional perspective on training, that prepared personnel for decision-making under impossible conditions. Training includes simulation exercises that practice emergency decision-making under time pressure, scenario-based training that covers equipment failure modes, psychological preparation for making life and death choices without time for extended analysis. But she added context that revealed the limitations of preparation for situations that existed beyond normal simulation capability. Complete preparation for the conditions Maria faced isn't possible through training alone. Some aspects of decision-making under extreme conditions can only be developed through actual experience with life and death choices. This admission revealed the edge of preparation where training ended and personal character began, where systematic preparation gave way to individual capability that couldn't be taught through normal military education. Walsh was struggling with psychological implications of making decisions that balanced personal survival against mission requirements. How do you maintain focus on mission objectives when you're making calculations about your own survival? Maria's answer revealed thinking that operated at levels beyond normal human psychology. Training develops automatic responses that maintain mission focus even under survival stress. You learn to compartmentalize personal risk assessment while maintaining operational effectiveness. Her voice carried undertones that suggested the psychological cost of developing such capabilities. But there's also acceptance that mission success might require personal sacrifice, that the strategic importance of the operation outweighs individual survival considerations. The psychological framework she was describing represented a form of mental training that existed only in the most elite military units, preparation that enabled functional decision-making under conditions where normal psychological responses would be paralyzed by the scope of threat and responsibility. Part 9. The Weight of Impossible Success. Rodriguez turned to a section of the mission log that recorded the resolution of the emergency. Documentation that showed how impossible problems were solved through combinations of technical skill, tactical thinking, and acceptance of risks that would have paralyzed normal decision-making processes. 0452 hours. Operative 3 reported successful emergency landing in designated secondary zone. Injury sustained but operational capability maintained. The successful emergency landing represented problem-solving under conditions where standard procedures would have failed, where survival required improvisation and technical skill that existed only at the highest levels of military capability. The fact that operational capability was maintained despite injuries during emergency landing under extreme conditions revealed preparation and determination that exceeded normal human responses to crisis situations. 0453 hours. Team regrouped at secondary assembly point. Mission parameters adjusted for reduced team size and modified timeline due to emergency landing complications. The mission continuation despite equipment failure and personnel injury revealed institutional thinking that balanced individual welfare against strategic importance. Decision-making frameworks that allowed operations to continue even when normal safety protocols would have required mission abort. Maria spoke with matter-of-fact precision that concealed the extraordinary nature of what she was describing. The emergency landing resulted in ankle fracture and mild hypothermia, but core mission capability remained intact. Pain management through field medical techniques, mobility maintained through improvised support systems. The clinical description of serious injuries treated under field conditions while maintaining operational effectiveness revealed both medical training and personal resilience that existed only in personnel selected for operations at the margins of human capability. Rodriguez continued reading from mission documentation that recorded tactical adaptation under conditions that would have challenged the most experienced operators. 0515 hours. Team reached target observation point. Intelligence gathering commenced. Despite weather conditions that limited visibility to less than 20 feet, the intelligence gathering under impossible visibility conditions represented mission continuation through adaptation of standard procedures to environmental constraints that would have made normal reconnaissance operations ineffective. Fletcher was trying to understand intelligence gathering techniques that could function under conditions where normal observation methods would be useless. How do you conduct effective reconnaissance when visibility is that limited? Maria's answer revealed techniques that combine traditional intelligence methods with technological solutions adapted for extreme conditions. Close-range photography using infrared imaging systems, audio surveillance equipment designed to function in high-wind environments, physical evidence collection that focused on material indicators rather than visual observation. But she added context that revealed the limitations of intelligence gathering under conditions that pushed both equipment and human capability beyond normal parameters. Intelligence quality was necessarily limited by environmental conditions. You gather what information is possible while accepting that comprehensive reconnaissance isn't achievable under those conditions. The admission revealed operational thinking that balanced information requirements against practical limitations, accepting reduced intelligence quality in exchange for maintaining mission timeline and strategic opportunity. David Kim was following the technical discussion with appreciation for adaptation that exceeded normal military flexibility. The equipment modifications for extreme conditions were those field modifications or pre-planned adaptations. Rodriguez answered with documentation that showed systematic preparation for environmental variables that couldn't be completely predicted through advanced planning. Equipment modifications included both pre-planned adaptations for known environmental conditions and field modification capability for unexpected circumstances. The preparation revealed thinking that anticipated the impossibility of complete advance planning while providing tools and training that enabled adaptation to circumstances that exceeded planning parameters. Morrison was beginning to understand operational flexibility that existed beyond his training and experience. The mission adaptation you're describing, was that individual improvisation or coordinated team decision-making? Maria's answer revealed command structure that distributed both authority and responsibility in ways that enabled rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. Team coordination for strategic decision-making combined with individual authority for tactical adaptation. Mission objectives remained constant while implementation methods adapted to actual conditions. This approach required both individual competence and team coordination that existed only in units, where personal capability was so high that individual tactical decisions could be trusted to support overall strategic objectives even when communication was limited by environmental factors. Walsh was struggling with mission completion requirements that exceeded her understanding of normal military operations. The intelligence objectives: were you able to achieve mission success despite all the equipment failures and environmental complications? Rodriguez's answer revealed institutional assessment of mission effectiveness that balanced strategic intelligence requirements against operational constraints that had pushed the mission beyond normal success parameters. Mission objectives were achieved within the constraints imposed by environmental conditions and equipment limitations. Intelligence gathered was sufficient to meet strategic requirements despite reduced operational capability. But she added context that revealed the cost of mission success under conditions that exceeded normal human capability. Mission success was measured against modified parameters that acknowledged the extraordinary nature of the operating environment. Complete mission success wasn't possible under those conditions, but strategic objectives were achieved. The institutional honesty about modified success criteria revealed military thinking that balanced operational idealism against practical reality, acknowledging that some missions required accepting partial success as extraordinary achievement given the circumstances. Maria spoke with understated precision that concealed the personal cost of mission completion under impossible conditions. The return extraction was conducted under deteriorating weather conditions that made helicopter insertion impossible. Ground movement to alternative extraction point required 12 hours of travel through terrain that would normally be considered impassable. The extraction complications revealed another dimension of operational complexity, where mission completion required endurance and navigation, capability that extended beyond the primary objective to include survival and recovery under conditions that continued to deteriorate throughout the operation. Rodriguez concluded the mission documentation with statistics that put the operation in context of broader strategic impact. Intelligence gathered during Operation Ghostfall contributed to prevention of 3 separate attacks on coalition forces, elimination of high-value targets whose location had been unknown for 18 months, strategic disruption of enemy coordination, networks that affected operations across the theater. The strategic impact revealed why impossible missions were considered worth the extraordinary risk and resource investment, showing how individual operations conducted under extreme conditions could have consequences that extended far beyond. Immediate tactical objectives. Part 10. The Reckoning, the Silence that followed. Rodriguez's mission summary was different from the uncomfortable quiet that had preceded her revelations. This was the silence of people processing information that fundamentally altered their understanding of what human capability could achieve. The kind of quiet that settled over groups who realized they'd been witnessing something beyond their comprehension. Morrison stood frozen in a posture that suggested his entire worldview was undergoing reconstruction. The confidence that had defined his interaction with Maria had evaporated, replaced by the pale recognition that he'd been questioning someone whose worst training day involved more real danger than he would face in his entire military career. His hands shook slightly as he processed the scope of his misjudgment, the way his assumptions had led him to mock someone whose service existed in dimensions he couldn't have imagined. Fletcher appeared to be struggling with cognitive dissonance, so severe it was almost physical, his face cycling through expressions that reflected the impossibility of reconciling the Maria he'd been mocking with the operational history Rodriguez had described. The casual cruelty of his earlier comments was transforming into something that looked like shame mixed with awe. The uncomfortable realization that he'd been participating in the humiliation of someone whose courage exceeded his capacity for understanding. Walsh had gone completely silent, her earlier eagerness to fit in with the group's mockery, replaced by the dawning understanding that she'd been complicit in something far worse than workplace harassment. She was learning that assumptions could be dangerous when applied to people whose backgrounds existed outside normal categories, that the price of belonging could include participating in cruelty directed at individuals who deserved respect rather than ridicule. David Kim was processing technical information that challenged his understanding of what was possible in aviation and survival engineering. As a civilian flight instructor, he thought he understood the limits of human capability and equipment performance, but Maria's background revealed operational territory that existed beyond normal aviation parameters, where engineering precision met human endurance at levels that redefined the possible. Lisa Torres was experiencing a mixture of professional respect and personal guilt as she realized how much Maria had endured without defending herself or revealing the extraordinary nature of her background. As the only other woman in the instructor group, Torres had been watching Maria navigate gender-based skepticism and professional questioning while carrying secrets that would have silenced critics if they'd been known. Master Sergeant Williams emerged fully from his office, drawn by the extended silence that had replaced normal hangar activity. He'd been expecting to find resolution to a minor personnel conflict, but the scene before him suggested something far more significant had occurred. The body language of everyone present indicated that fundamental power dynamics had shifted, that whatever Rodriguez had revealed had transformed casual workplace friction into something that required institutional response. Rodriguez closed the classified folder with deliberate precision. The action marking the end of revelations that had pulled back curtains on operational history that most people would never know existed. The folder represented information that existed in the spaces between official acknowledgement and public awareness, stories that shaped strategic outcomes while remaining invisible to the people they protected. "The reason I'm sharing this information," Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made difficult decisions about classification and institutional transparency, "isn't to embarrass anyone or to reveal operational details unnecessarily. It's to provide context that should inform how we evaluate competence and how we treat people whose backgrounds we don't understand." Her words carried implications that extended beyond the immediate situation, touching on institutional problems that existed throughout military and civilian organizations where assumptions about capability were based on visible indicators rather than actual competence. The lesson wasn't just about Maria's specific background, but about the danger of judging people based on incomplete information. Maria spoke for the first time since Rodriguez had begun her revelations, her voice carrying none of the defensiveness that might have been expected from someone whose privacy had been exposed for educational purposes. General Rodriguez didn't need to share any of this. "My qualifications for this position are documented through normal channels, and my performance speaks for itself." But her tone suggested acceptance of the necessity for revelation when respect couldn't be achieved through normal professional interaction. However, when assumptions turn into accusations, when professional skepticism becomes personal attack, sometimes classification has to give way to education. The distinction she was drawing revealed sophisticated thinking about the balance between operational security and institutional responsibility, understanding that protecting classified information had to be weighed against preventing harmful behavior based on ignorance. Rodriguez addressed the group with the kind of direct communication that left no room for misunderstanding. Military service takes many forms, some of which are visible and officially recognized, others of which exist in classified programs that protect both operational security and personnel safety. The assumption that civilian contractor status indicates inferior capability demonstrates exactly the kind of thinking that creates problems. She looked specifically at Morrison, Fletcher, and Walsh, making sure they understood that her comments were directed at behavior that required correction. When you question someone's qualifications based on assumptions about their background, when you mock someone whose experience you don't understand, you're not just being disrespectful. You're demonstrating ignorance about how military capability actually works. Morrison finally found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Ma'am, we had no way of knowing about her background. Her file doesn't contain any of this information." Rodriguez's response revealed institutional complexities that existed at the intersection of classification requirements and personnel management. Personnel files for individuals with compartmentalized backgrounds necessarily contain limited information. Classification requirements mean that actual qualifications and experience often can't be documented through normal channels. She gestured toward Maria, who was listening with the calm expression of someone who'd learned to accept the institutional challenges that came with classified service. Maria's position here isn't coincidental. High-altitude training programs benefit from expertise that exists only in specialized communities. But that expertise can't be officially acknowledged without compromising operational security. The revelation added another layer to Maria's situation, suggesting that her assignment at Nellis served institutional purposes that went beyond normal contractor employment while maintaining the classification boundaries that protected sensitive information about capabilities and methods. Fletcher was struggling with implications that challenged his understanding of military hierarchy and recognition systems. "Ma'am, if her qualifications are so extensive, why isn't she in uniform with appropriate rank and official recognition?" Rodriguez's answer revealed bureaucratic, realities that existed at the intersection of specialized capability and institutional structure. Military rank and recognition systems are designed for conventional career paths and standard operations. Personnel who serve in compartmentalized programs often find that their experience doesn't translate to normal promotion criteria. She looked at Maria, who nodded slightly, indicating permission for further explanation about institutional challenges that affected people with classified backgrounds. When your service record consists of operations that can't be acknowledged, achievements that can't be documented, skills that can't be officially recognized, conventional military career progression becomes impossible. The institutional irony was becoming clear to everyone listening. The military had created programs that required extraordinary capability and dedication, then established bureaucratic systems that couldn't accommodate the people who served. In those programs, creating career dead ends for individuals whose contributions were too sensitive for normal recognition. Part 11. The Cost of Hidden Service. Rodriguez opened a different section of her folder, revealing documentation that showed the personal cost of service in programs that existed outside normal military structure. The papers contained psychological evaluation reports, medical assessments, and career counseling records that painted a picture of institutional challenges that went far beyond operational danger. Personnel who serve in compartmentalized programs face unique career challenges that don't exist in conventional military service. Their experience can't be documented through normal channels. Their achievements can't be officially recognized. Their skills often don't translate to civilian employment that provides comparable responsibility and compensation. The documentation she was referencing revealed systematic problems that affected entire communities of people who'd served in classified programs, institutional failures that created second-class status for individuals whose contributions had been essential to national security but couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Maria spoke with understated precision that concealed the personal impact of career limitations imposed by classification requirements. After Ghostfall was decommissioned, transition to conventional military service required starting over with no official record of previous experience. Civilian employment required explaining gaps in work history that couldn't be filled in without violating classification agreements. Her matter-of-fact description revealed challenges that existed at the intersection of personal career development and institutional security requirements, where dedication to national service created barriers to normal professional progression. Rodriguez continued with statistics that put individual cases in the context of broader institutional problems. Approximately 60% of personnel who serve in compartmentalized programs experience significant career transition difficulties. 30% report challenges with civilian employment due to inability to document relevant experience. 20% require ongoing psychological support for readjustment to environments where their skills and experience can't be fully utilized. The numbers revealed that Maria's situation wasn't unique, but part of systematic challenges that affected communities of people who'd made extraordinary sacrifices in service of national security, while remaining invisible to the recognition systems that honored more conventional military service. Walsh was beginning to understand personal costs that she'd never considered. The psychological impact of not being able to talk about your service. How do you deal with that kind of isolation? Maria's answer revealed coping mechanisms that existed only in communities of people who shared similar experiences with classified service. Support networks exist among people who've served in similar programs, but they're necessarily limited and informal. Most psychological adjustment involves accepting that recognition for this type of service comes from internal satisfaction rather than external acknowledgement. But her tone suggested that acceptance came with ongoing personal cost, the weight of carrying achievements that couldn't be shared, experiences that couldn't be discussed, contributions that couldn't be acknowledged through normal social and Professional channels. Rodriguez added institutional perspective on support systems that existed for personnel transitioning from classified programs. Military and veteran services are designed for conventional service members whose experience can be documented and whose needs can be addressed through standard programs. Personnel with compartmentalized backgrounds often fall through gaps in support systems. The institutional failure was becoming clear as a systematic problem, where the people who'd made the greatest sacrifices received the least support. Where classification requirements created barriers to accessing services that were designed to help veterans transition to civilian life. David Kim was processing information that challenged his understanding of veteran employment and career transition. The civilian contractor positions are those designed to provide career opportunities for people with classified backgrounds. Rodriguez's answer revealed one of the few institutional solutions that had been developed to address career transition challenges for personnel with compartmentalized experience. Civilian contractor positions provide one of the limited pathways for utilizing specialized skills while maintaining classification boundaries. They allow individuals to continue contributing to national security while working within systems that can accommodate their unique backgrounds. But she added context that revealed the limitations of contractor employment as a solution to broader institutional problems. Contractor positions provide income and professional purpose, but they don't address the deeper issues of recognition, career advancement, and social integration that affect people whose service can't be acknowledged. Morrison was struggling with recognition that his behavior had been part of institutional problems that extended far beyond personal rudeness. "Ma'am, when we questioned her qualifications, we were perpetuating exactly the kind of assumptions that make career transition difficult for people with classified backgrounds." Rodriguez confirmed his understanding with the directness of someone who'd seen these problems affect too many good people. "Exactly. When you assume that civilian contractor status indicates inferior capability, when you question competence based on visible indicators rather than actual performance, you're contributing to systematic discrimination against people whose service can't be conventionally documented." The institutional dimension of their behavior was becoming clear as participation in problems that affected entire communities of veterans whose service existed outside normal recognition systems, making their individual actions part of broader patterns of discrimination based on incomplete understanding. Fletcher was beginning to grasp systemic implications that extended beyond personal apologies. How do we avoid making these kinds of assumptions about other people whose backgrounds we don't understand? Maria answered with wisdom that came from years of navigating professional environments where her capabilities were consistently underestimated. Start by recognizing that competence comes in many forms, that civilian contractor status doesn't indicate anything about previous experience or capability, that performance should be evaluated based on actual work rather than assumptions about background. Her advice revealed thinking that balanced practical workplace dynamics with broader principles about respect and professional evaluation. Understanding that preventing discrimination required changing fundamental assumptions about how competence was identified and valued. Rodriguez added institutional perspective on cultural changes that were needed to address systematic problems affecting veterans with classified backgrounds. Military and civilian organizations need to develop better understanding of the career paths that lead people to contractor positions. Recognition that some of the most capable individuals may have backgrounds that can't be conventionally documented. The cultural change she was describing required institutional learning that went beyond individual behavior modification to systematic revision of assumptions about capability, career progression, and the relationship between official recognition and actual competence. The immediate participants in the original confrontation were experiencing personal reckonings that went far beyond simple embarrassment about workplace rudeness. Morrison, Fletcher, and Walsh were processing information that fundamentally challenged their understanding of competence, service, and the relationship between visible indicators and actual capability. Morrison was struggling with recognition that his behavior had been based on assumptions that revealed ignorance about how military capability actually worked, that his confidence in questioning Maria's qualifications had been inversely related to his actual understanding of what those qualifications might represent. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was learning uncomfortable truths about his own limitations. "I've been thinking about military service in terms of conventional career paths and official recognition. I didn't understand that some of the most important service happens outside those frameworks." His admission revealed personal growth that extended beyond apology to fundamental revision of assumptions about how capability was developed and how service was performed. Recognition that his worldview had been limited by visibility rather than informed by understanding. Rodriguez acknowledged his learning with the kind of recognition that suggested institutional hope for cultural change. That understanding is exactly what's needed. Military capability includes many dimensions that aren't captured by conventional career progression or official recognition systems. Her response transformed Morrison's personal learning into institutional validation, making his recognition of previous ignorance into a positive example of the kind of attitude change that was needed throughout military and civilian organizations. Fletcher was experiencing cognitive reconstruction that challenged fundamental assumptions about what constituted impressive military service. "I keep thinking about the operations you described, the level of personal risk and technical complexity. It makes conventional military training seem almost easy by comparison." His perspective revealed understanding that excellence existed in dimensions he hadn't previously considered, that the spectrum of military capability extended far beyond his previous awareness or imagination. Maria responded with generosity that reflected hard-won wisdom about the diversity of military service and the importance of respecting different forms of contribution. Every type of military service involves challenges and sacrifices that deserve respect. The goal isn't to create hierarchies of difficulty or importance, but to recognize that capability takes many forms. Her response revealed thinking that balanced acknowledgement of extraordinary achievement with respect for all forms of military service, avoiding the creation of new forms of discrimination while ensuring that exceptional capability received appropriate recognition. Walsh was processing personal guilt about her participation in behavior that she now understood had been deeply inappropriate. "I was trying to fit in with the group, but I realized that belonging shouldn't come at the cost of participating in cruelty directed at someone who deserved respect." Her recognition revealed understanding that professional environments required individual responsibility for maintaining respectful behavior, that group dynamics couldn't excuse participation in harassment or discrimination. Rodriguez addressed Walsh's guilt with institutional perspective that balanced individual accountability with recognition of systematic problems that created environments where inappropriate behavior could flourish. Personal responsibility is important, but it's also worth recognizing that institutional cultures can encourage or discourage respectful behavior. The goal is to create environments where respect is the default rather than the exception. Her response transformed individual guilt into motivation for institutional improvement, making Walsh's recognition of inappropriate behavior into positive energy for creating better professional environments. David Kim was experiencing professional humility as he recognized how much he didn't know about the military communities that worked alongside civilian aviation professionals. "I've been working with military contractors for years, but I realize I've never understood the diversity of backgrounds and experience that exist in those communities." His admission revealed recognition that professional competence required ongoing learning about the people and communities that constituted professional Environments that assumptions based on limited information could create barriers to effective collaboration. Lisa Torres spoke with appreciation for learning that helped her understand challenges faced by colleagues whose background she hadn't fully appreciated. This conversation has made me realize how much courage it takes to work in professional environments where your capabilities are consistently underestimated and your background can't be explained. Her perspective revealed empathy that extended beyond individual sympathy to systematic understanding of challenges faced by people whose service and capability existed outside normal recognition frameworks. Maria responded to the growing understanding with acknowledgement that validation, while appreciated, wasn't the primary goal of professional work. Recognition is nice, but it's not necessary for job satisfaction. The work itself is rewarding, the opportunity to contribute to training that improves military capability, the satisfaction of applying skills in environments where they can make a difference. Her response revealed professional maturity that found meaning in contribution rather than recognition, personal satisfaction that didn't depend on external validation while appreciating respectful professional treatment. Rodriguez was observing personal transformations that suggested hope for broader institutional change. What's happening here demonstrates exactly the kind of learning that needs to take place throughout military and civilian organizations. Individual recognition of previous assumptions, personal commitment to changed behavior, institutional support for respectful professional environments. Her observation transformed individual learning into institutional validation, making personal growth into positive examples of the kind of cultural change that was needed to address systematic problems affecting veteran communities and professional environments. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.